Hello fellow Unreal Engine artists, designers and developers, and welcome back to this landscape material series. In today's episode we're going to make some refinements to our UV tiling so that we can have separate tiling layouts for each layer and also sort out the issue where the textures are not square. So before we get going on today's tutorial, I need to fix a bug that I introduced in the last episode, and this is a timely reminder that whenever you introduce new features, make sure you test your material and see if everything still works as before. So here's the problem. If I show the RVT, and you might notice that the cliff faces are looking a bit dark, and particularly if I switch off the snow, you can see that the cliff faces at the top are much darker than they were before. And I kind of looked at this and pretty much guessed straight away what the problem was. So go back to your master material. This is what we did in the last episode. We introduced this transform vector to transform the tangent space to world space before we wrote it to the RVT. And that way we had a common coordinate system to transform when we did the blending. However, when it's coming out of the runtime virtual texture sample, we didn't convert it back, so it is in world space. And that's why if we go back to the landscapes that are facing kind of straight up look pretty much the same, but those that are perpendicular, like the cliff faces, don't have the right normal space on them. So simple fix. Let's go back here and let's take that normal and do a transform. And we want to transform it back. So we did it from tangent space to world space. So in this one, we want to do it from world space back to tangent space. So the normal is on the correct face of the receiving object. And then we'll plug that into the normal set material attributes. That should fix the issue. So let's do a save. Go back to our viewport, and after a few seconds you can see that those cliff faces in particular are back to the same values they were before we did the transform. So that's fixed that issue. And actually, while we're here and talking about RVTs, let's just add one more thing as well. So if you look at the landscape material, you can see that we are assuming here that we have a runtime virtual texture ability. So not all your destination platforms may have the ability to run runtime virtual textures. So we can't assume in our shader that we're always going to have RVT features. So what we really need to do is add another switch in here, which goes from the regular shader if we don't have virtual texturing capabilities. So let's just create a bit of space before the show RVT switch here. So move the output over, move the show RVT over a bit, and then right click in this empty space and look for virtual texture. We're looking for virtual texture feature switch right there at the bottom. So if the system that you're deployed on supports virtual textures, then it will go through the yes node. If it doesn't, it will go through the no node. So what we'll do is we'll take our output from here and put it into yes, and then on to show RVT. But if we don't have virtual texture supported, then we'll just have to take the regular landscape layer blend that didn't go through the runtime virtual texture. So let's just create a reroute node here and plug that in there. And that just deals with platforms that don't support the runtime virtual textures. Now there is one other area we need to put this virtual texture switch in, and that's in our depth fade mask, where we used the runtime virtual texture replace. So go into your material functions, find the MF depth fade mask here, and you can see we had two different depth fade types depending on whether we were running the regular shader or writing it to the RVT. So all we need to do is give us a bit of extra space here, find that same virtual texture feature switch. If the virtual texture feature switch is yes, then we can plug our RVT mask in and onto the virtual texture output. But if we don't have virtual textures, we're going to take our regular camera depth fade and then plug that in there. So the runtime virtual texture replace will just use the default camera depth fade. So that should fix the issue. Save and apply, and the same on the master material, save and apply. Nothing should change here, but if you do deploy it to a platform that doesn't support it, that should work for you. All right, let's get on with the tiling. So we're going to add two things today, both fairly simple. At the moment, in our tiling, we just have these two parameters in our material instance, a near tiling size and a far tiling size. And those are applied to every texture, every layer in our landscape. But we might want to vary this tiling size between the different layers. So for example, it works well for this valley, the forest path. But if we go over to this path over here, which was the mid-high material, that is probably too large a tiling size there, and maybe even for the near tiling as well. So it'd be good to have a parameter for each layer that allows us to change those. We'll call it a tiling factor. So this will be the general purpose one, 4 and 48, and then we'll have a tiling factor that defaults to 1, so we can increase or decrease the tiling per layer. So pretty easy to do, and you would probably even be able to do this yourself. But let's go through it together into the master material, and let's find the sections for creating the layers. And we've got this material function for creating the layer. So let's open that up. And near the beginning, so we have this section here that takes in our near and far UVs and does tiling variation. So this near UV and far UV here, we can just add another couple of parameters for multiplying them by this factor. So let's add another multiplier. So we'll do input, and this is going to be called near UV tiling factor, and it's not a vector 3, it's a scalar value, and we will multiply. In fact, we'll just close that down a bit, multiply that by the near UV, and then plug that on into the tiling variation. And then similarly, we want another one for the far UV. So let's duplicate both of these, and we'll call this one far UV tiling factor. And then we just need to create some space. So let's just move this up a bit. Move this out of the way for a second. And then move our other tiling factor down here. So it's a bit messy at the moment, but we'll sort out all those nodes in a second. And our outputs are all coming from the multiply now. So after rearranging our nodes a bit, you can see that you have something that looks like this. So we've added this multiply node that multiplies the near UV by the near UV tiling factor. And we've done the same with the far UV, and we've multiplied that by a far UV tiling factor. So let's make these defaults as well. So in each of these, we can make the preview value, and we can do it here. We can make preview value of 1, and the same with the far UV tiling factor preview, and we can put 1 in here. And in terms of the sort priority, let's have a look at near UV is 5, far UV is 7. So let's do the same for these. So let's do near UV was 5. Let's do near UV tiling factor 5. This doesn't really matter. This is just for the material function, not what the end user sees. And then far UV 7, far UV tiling factor 7. Okay, and let's plug this into, so I've just saved and applied it. Let's plug this into, let's say the ground layer, just to test it out. So if you go back to the main material, and let's go down to the up to the top to the ground layer, and you should see there are two new parameters here, near UV tiling factor and far UV tiling factor. So we just need to create the parameters for them. So let's move the near UV and the far UV in a bit there, and now we'll just copy these. So ground normal intensity we'll duplicate, and we'll call this ground near tiling factor with a default value of 1. And let's have a look. Normal intensity was priority 4, so let's do this as 5. Ground near tiling variation was 6, 7. So we might change those to 7 and 8. Again, I'll check this in a minute. And plug the ground near tiling factor into our near UV tiling factor, and then we'll duplicate this and call it ground far tiling factor. Still got a preview of 1, and this will be priority 6. Okay, let's save that. And if you look at the material instance over here, we've got ground near tiling factor, and where's our ground? Oh, we haven't plugged the ground far tiling factor in, so let's plug that into the far UV tiling factor and then save that. And now we've got ground far tiling factor. And there is one in between, which is this slope constraint. This slope constraint, I'd actually quite like to make that the first parameter, because that's usually the first thing you want to set for each layer. So let's quickly find that and sort that out. So if you go to the masks here, and the very first parameter is ground slope constraint, so let's make that sort priority 0, save, and that moves that up to the top. So now we've got, after the normal intensity, we've got a near tiling factor and a far tiling factor. And let's test these out. So back to the landscape, and on the ground we've got the tiling factors with the default of 1 and 1. So 1 and 1. So if I make the near tiling factor 2, you can see, or 3, you can see that it is putting those tiles close together. So there are 3 tiles where there was 1 tile before. And if I make it something like 0.3, you can see that it is a third the size of, or rather a third as many tiles in the same space. So now we have the ability to change those, and it should work for the far tiling as well. So if I zoom out a bit and have a look over here, for example, where I can see the far tiling, a little bit more detail. So again, if I want to make it smaller, I'll double the tiling factor, or 3 times. And similarly, if I do 0.3, I get much larger tiling there. So that seems to be working fine. So now I can change these in all of the different layers. So if I wanted to change it in the mid-high layer for the path here, I would go back to my landscape and I would plug in those parameters into the mid-high layer. So let's find where I was. The ground layer here. So let's copy these 2 parameters. So drag around them, Control C, and then if I go down to the mid-high layer here, I'll just move these masks over here a bit, do a Control V, rename these mid-high near tiling factor and mid-high far tiling factor. Plug these into the correct input pins, near UV tiling factor and far UV tiling factor. And we'll also change the slope constraint for this one as well, the mid-high and the mid-low while we're at it. So click on Save and Apply. Go over to your masks and choose the mid-low slope constraint and make that sort priority 0 to put it at the front, and the same with the mid-high, make the sort priority 0. Click on Save. And now we go back to our landscape, and what we'll do is we'll zoom in a bit on this so we can see a bit of the near tiling and the far tiling. And now if you look at the mid-high here, we've probably still got it in the ground group. So go back to your landscape and find the mid-high layer and change this ground group to mid-high and the far tiling factor to mid-high. Click on Save, and now we have these two new parameters here, defaulting to values of 1. So now if we want to make this tiling nearer to us a little bit more dense, we can change the tiling factor to 2, and you can see that we now have much more densely packed textures there, although you can see the repeating patterns. So we probably want to add the near tiling variation and far tiling variation parameters in here as well. So I'll put that back to 1 for now. And then if we look at our far one, that seems a little bit on the large side, so let's factor that up by 2. And you can see that that has made the stones a little bit smaller in that particular texture. So now with this tiling factor, we have control over each individual layer, having set a general purpose tiling size in the landscape general section. Okay, let's now move on and sort out another problem which was brought to my attention when we did one of the very first videos, and that is that this texture on the valley floor, this forest path texture, is not a square texture. In fact, you can see if you open it up, let's take this, here's the ground layer. If I double click on the texture here, you can see, especially if I drag it over here, you can see that it's not a square texture. And the texture imported is 1K by 2K. So it reflected a 1 by 2 meter scan. So what that means is that we're treating it as a square texture. We're doing UV tiling based on uniform U and V coordinates. So what that means is that it's actually being stretched in one of the directions. And you can probably see, if you really look closely, that some of these sort of stones here seem to be stretched more in one direction, this sort of direction here, than they are in this direction. So what we want to do is add an aspect ratio function, which will default to 1, assuming things are square, but if they're not, we can adjust that. So let's go back into our master material. And if you've still got your create layer open, then go to that or find it and double click to open it. And what we need to do is we need to add a little bit more UV manipulation in here to change that aspect if we need to. So let's actually, to test this out, let's actually go back to our grid view, and that way we'll be able to see what this is doing when we've implemented it. So come back here and reset these two base color, ground base color and ground normal by hitting the reset button. And then to get it to see in here, you'll just have to quickly change another parameter because it doesn't think anything's changed yet. So just change the ground near tiling factor to 2, and then let's go back to 1. Okay, so now we can see our tiling here, and you can see that we're treating this texture as a square texture at the moment. So we're seeing this even textures on the U coordinate side and the V, or X and Y. So in order to change this, all we need to do is take our UV coordinates and multiply one of them by an aspect ratio. So let's create a function to do that. So go into your material functions folder and let's create a new material function. We're going to call it MF aspect ratio. And input is going to be a vector 2. That's going to be our UVs. And the output we're going to call UVs with aspect applied. And this is going to be a very simple function. What we're going to do is we're going to take our UVs and we're going to break them out into two components. So you can do breakout float 2. So that breaks them into the individual U and V. So we want to leave one of them unaffected, and the other one we want to apply a ratio. So we'll do another input. And this will be called aspect ratio. Preview value of 1, but actually it's not a vector 3, it's a scalar. So we've just got a default single value of 1, and then we'll take that and we will multiply the second output by this aspect ratio. And now we need to just recombine our UVs again. So there is a make float 2 node. We're going to leave the U unaffected, and the V is going to be multiplied by our aspect ratio, and that will then become the output. So again, just to recap, if our aspect ratio is 1, then nothing will change here. Our UVs will come in and they will go out exactly as they were before. But if we have an aspect ratio different from 1, say 2, then the U value will stay the same, but the V value will be doubled, effectively stretching it or halving it on the V axis. So that is our material function. Now we just want to use that in the create layer function. So close that one down, open up your material function for create layer. And now you might think, where do I do this? Do I do this after applying the tiling factor? Do I do it before the tiling variation where we rotated and scaled our UVs? Well, this MF tiling variation expects uniform UVs here. I've done a few tests on this, so we need to do the aspect ratio after we've done the tiling variation. So let's create a bit of space here. So move this back a bit here. Let's move everything from these switch over here. In fact, let's leave the switch there. Let's just move the near UV and far UV reroute nodes here. Because even if we're not doing any tiling variation and we're coming down this route, we still want to maybe do the aspect ratio. So now, with that open, go down here to your material functions, drag in this new aspect ratio, and plug in the output from here into UVs. We'll probably change these around so that aspect ratio is second, and plug it in there. And let's just do that actually. So double click on aspect ratio and make the input UVs priority 1 and the input aspect ratio 2, and save that. And now we've got them in this sequence. And let's also duplicate this and plug it into the far UV option here as well. Okay, so now we need to plug in an aspect ratio. So we're now in another material function here. So this is sort of nested material functions. So this is a material function called by the master landscape, and it calls another material function as well. So we need another input here, and this is going to be UV aspect ratio. It's a scalar value, default of 1. And then we will plug that into these aspect ratios. So we don't need two separate parameters. the aspect ratio will apply equally to our near texture and our far texture. So that's fine to plug those into there. Click on Save. And then the last thing we need to do is to apply that in our main Create Layer master material. So if we come out of here and let's find the ground layer, you can see it's right at the top here. So again, you can move it around by changing the sort priority, but for now, let's just leave it up here. And I'm just going to apply it to the ground layer. If you want it on the other layers, you can just repeat creating the parameter here. So what we'll do is, again, borrow a parameter. So let's take ground normal intensity and duplicate it. And let's call this ground UV aspect ratio. Default value of 1. In terms of sort priority, let's just save it and see where it appears in the material instance. Oh, we need to attach it, sorry. So attach it to the UV aspect ratio input and then save it. Okay, at the moment it is above the near tiling factors and near tiling and far tiling. I would suggest that it needs to come after that because it's not going to be changed very often. So the ground far tiling variation was 8. So let's try a sort priority of 9 here. And it actually comes after add puddles. So that's fine. We can always change that later on. So let's choose that ground UV aspect ratio and go back to the main material and let's play around with it. So at the moment we've got our square tiling here. If we change the aspect ratio to 2, you can see that it is now being stretched out twice the length on one of the axes. And similarly, if you do 0.5, it will be stretched out on the other axis. So the aspect, it depends on the texture as to which way you need to stretch it, but you have both those options. So with that in mind, let's go back to the correct materials to see if we can fix this problem with the forest path. So I'm going to connect this to the forest path base color and the forest path normal. Okay, and this is where we're at the moment. So let's just go look down so it's a bit more obvious when things change. Okay, so as I said, these stones here seem to be a little bit stretched, and down here you can see they're stretched here. So let's try, I don't know which way round we need to do this, but let's try making the ground UV aspect ratio 2 and see what happens. And if anything, that's made it worse. So I seem to have stretched it more on one axis. So I suspect it's not the V direction I need to stretch, it's the U direction. So instead of 2, I'll make it 0.5. And look at that. We suddenly have the texture in the right aspect. So those stones now look much more square and less stretched out. So we've sorted out that problem. So most textures are square. So you'll plug this UV aspect ratio in, leave it as the default of 1. But if you do have the occasional texture which is stretched out, then you can apply this aspect ratio to fix it. So it was a shorter video today after all of the long RVT ones. I hope you found it useful. As always, in the next episode, we're going to cover displacement. So it's still, I would say, in an experimental phase, but it's definitely worth showing you how it works. There is a bit of a performance hit, worse in 5.4 than 5.5, but I'll go through how you set it up and things you need to be aware of when you're implementing it. So stay tuned for that, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.